Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, every once in a while I'll get a question from a viewer. I get quite a few actually, but every once in a while I'll get one that really piques my interest. So I got one about a week ago that really kind of piqued my interest. And I was supposed to be playing tonight, but the game fell through. Somebody had something come up. So I found myself with some time, so I figured maybe I'll try to answer this question because it's a really good one. So I'm going to try this kind of extemporaneously, and if it comes out really terrible, then I'll try it again, maybe do some bullet points or something like that. But anyhow, the viewer's name is Rob H. He says, "Hi there, I've recently discovered your channel and have really enjoyed watching your journey into more narrative systems from your OSR comfort zone. Now that your experiment with The Veil is over, I'm curious if your bias has shifted. Do you still prefer traditional/OSR games? Personally," he goes on, "my journey has kind of been the opposite of yours. I started with 3.5, which I'm assuming is 3.5 Dungeons & Dragons, but got quickly frustrated with the mechanics getting in the way of the story. Then I discovered Fate, PBTA, and Burning Wheel and thought that these systems that put story first, fiction first, were what I was always looking for, and played these kind of systems exclusively for a while. But still, these games had mechanics that were getting in the way of the actual play experience, as they were constantly trying to push certain cliches, tropes, or drive drama with narrative mechanics like fate points or XP incentives or whatever, instead of just letting things happen spontaneously in the fiction." I inserted a comma there, whether it wasn't a comma. "Instead of just letting things happen spontaneously in the fiction. Then, finally, I found the OSR, and having these minimal rulings over rules systems has felt right, in quotation marks, and has been delivering the play experience I've always wanted. In any case, I really love to hear how your perspective has changed." And so I found that question pretty interesting and compelling. Excuse me. I think that's some Diet Coke, lemon ginger Diet Coke in this Polar bottle, because it's easier to drink out of. It's Ghost should drink out of a big 2-liter bottle. Anyhow, I found anytime that we talk about our evolution as a gamer, our journey as a gamer, that's really fascinating to me, because I've had one myself. I mean, I've been playing since 1981, but I had big chunks of time where I wasn't playing, so in many ways I have a shorter experience than some other people that, of my age or that have been playing even for a shorter period of time than I have. But still, I've had an evolution. I've talked to other people that have had evolutions. Heck, if you look at my channel from when it started in 2011, I think, to now, I've had quite an evolution. Even in the last 2 or 3 years, I've had quite an evolution as I've really branched out and started playing a whole bunch of different games that, before I was not interested in, as he alluded to. But I find it really telling. I enjoy the fact that Rob shared his own experience and not just said, I just went from this to this, but why? And what he found was lacking or was causing him problems. The idea that he said he's playing 3.5, but these mechanics were getting in the way of the story. Same Old G has this great trifecta of, talk to the players, play the right game, and, don't be a jerk. And I always add, play with the right people as well, although you can argue that that comes from following some of the other ones. But anyhow, part of playing the right game is we find often that systems will fight us when we have a certain intention. I've made videos talking about this. You'll have mechanics, and perhaps what Rob's getting at is these mechanics in something like 3.5, in a more complex system, got in the way of the story, because sometimes the mechanics will simply produce results that aren't congruent with what you're trying to do. And sometimes you find yourself playing the wrong game. And he goes on to talk about the idea that, he's tried all these other games like PBTA, like Fate, like Burning Wheel, which have all these mechanics which, in a certain way tend to put fiction first. So they make the play experience about something, and they really push very hard. And the whole idea of like there's traditional games and indie games, that's kind of crap. They're just games that do different things or whatever. But there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens in those games. But for him, he found that they were pushing things too much in a certain direction, and he wanted to just, have things happen spontaneously in the fiction without being pushed there. Just let it happen. And I can relate to that. And he's found that these OSR games and the rulings over rules, which are allowing him to do that. But, I was thinking about that. Part of, one of the things that's happened for me, and I always have to fight this knee-jerk reaction. I forget who that says it. It might be Adam Koebel. Might not be. But he talks about the idea that he asks the question, what is your game about? How does it do that? And, I always have this knee-jerk reaction in the beginning of like, well, okay, what's your game about? Okay, great. How does it do that? And I always think to myself, well, wait a minute, we do that. We, the players, the group of people, which includes the game master, we can sit around the table and make this happen, right? It's not always the case, but that's, something that, we had to back in the day, so to speak, because, the games that I grew up with, and certainly in many cases the games that would qualify as OSR were rules light or something that emphasizes rulings over rules. At the end of the day, games like that, and I'm being I'm way too general here, but it has nothing to do with just old D&D retro clones. There's a bunch of games that you boil them down, and mostly what they are is a small series of resolution mechanics. And then everything else about them, you make up. Whether the game turns into something that's very narrative, or very tactical, or where it's somebody spinning this grand story and everybody else is pretty much supplying like dialogue and being a thespian and making some decisions, but pretty much, it's going to be about, in some way, shape, or form, there's a big bad guy someplace and, there's a quest to do the thing or something about it. It's not a totally pre-planned story, but there's a thing. This is what we're going to be doing. There's various cultures of play that show up that make the game into something. But we, as the group, as the culture, make it do that, if you follow me. And we were talking to Ron Edwards, and then watching his Finding D&D videos, talking to him personally, and then making my kind of talking about my own experience, as well as talking to Anthony and a bunch of other people that are of an age, although I'm a little bit older. It was surprising to a lot of us to find that all throughout the world, people were playing these same games, but playing them very differently, because whatever our local culture was kind of informed that game, informed how the play was going to be. Enter all these other games that Rob H is talking about, which very much take seriously, like, okay, what is this game about? How does it do that? And they're full of procedures. Samuel G talks about this a lot. There's you follow the procedure, you follow the protocol, and it's going to produce this guaranteed result. In a lot of cases, that is very, very true. And so my experience with a lot of these, I'm still enjoying playing games that have much more of a prescriptive feel to them. And to me, at the end of the day, this particular topic has been really fascinating. The idea, like, you play some games that are more prescriptive, that put in some kind of procedures, or like, well, how do we get this particular thing to happen? Because we all want this. We've all decided that we're a group maybe that wants something that's a little bit more, I hate to use story-driven because it's the wrong thing, but we want to push a particular genre, or we want to experience a certain type of feel. And now we're playing a game which has procedures, or procedures. not necessarily just rules, but the way we're going to play the game is going to produce that, which is different from, but somewhat related to the mechanics themselves. Something like, I'm going all over the place, so this is extemporaneous, kids. This is what you get. It's interesting to see what various systems do, what kind of feel they produce. I've talked a lot about the idea that Ubiquity produces this kind of pulp heroic feel. I'm finding more and more the Fantasy Flight games, Star Wars, and the Genesis, once again, will produce this very kind of amped up pulp heroic feel. You can't use that system for everything, because when you play it, when you use Ubiquity, when you use Genesis or Narrative Dice System, it's going to produce that feel every single time. If you use D100, I'm finding that it's going to produce a very different feel. You use the mechanics in Circle of Hands, very different feel. Combat is awful, just awful. And I don't mean it's bad, I mean it's just brutal and nasty and short. All these games produce a very, very different feel via the mechanics themselves, which is another very interesting thing. But the procedures, outlined in all these games that are much more prescriptive, they certainly produce a feel. The other thing that I've found in these games, which is fascinating, which is probably more fascinating to me, or more importable or useful, is some of their philosophy. It's not just like, what is a procedure, but why? Why are we doing this? And in a lot of cases, many of them turn out to be sort of best practices for producing a certain kind of game. You know, without going too much into it, I'm really realizing more and more that the procedures in Circle of Hands produce a very, very specific type of experience where player decisions matter a lot. And the game turns out to be about what the characters find important. And it's not direct, it's play becomes, it looks like it's going to be very, very emergent. In a very different way, something like the Powered by the Apocalypse games, they have these agendas and principles. And I'm forgetting the other official word they use for them, but the idea, these are things you should do. Don't plan everything that's going to happen. It becomes more, a little bit more player directed in terms of what they find interesting, but at the same time, you can, beat them over the head, because that's part of what happens as well in those games. But it's not something where you come up with a pre-planned story. That's completely anathema to that experience. And in fact, the game gives you, well, here's these best practices to use to make sure that this particular type of experience emerges. I'm probably not saying that well enough, but you get the idea. And ditto for something like Burning Wheel, which I've read but I have not played. My friends Eloy and Samuel G have played it, and I'd love to get them like in a round table just talking about that experience. But part of what interests me is taking those best practices, if you will, and they're only best practices if you want a certain kind of feel. Now, how do you take that kind of approach to a game, and apply it to something that's very, very rules light, like pick an OSR game, or pick some other game that's really, really, when you boil it down, it's just a bunch of resolution mechanics. It's not really about anything. It doesn't produce an experience other than what the mechanics produce. Imagine a game where you strip away everything else and it's just a resolution mechanic. So maybe it does feel very, very pulp heroic or super heroic, like something like Fate, or it feels very grim and dark because most of the time you fail, that sort of thing, and that's all there is to it. Then, well, how do you make it do something else? Or not fight those mechanics, but how do you produce the rest of the experience? How do you make this an experience where we all mutually contribute to a story in a writer's room type of sense? How do we make it so it's very, very emergent and the character decisions matter? How do you play that very same game, but play it in a way that a lot of people play, where the game master has this grand vision, and they sing this song, and everybody else provides harmonic content. What do you do? What are the procedures to do that? So I find that pretty interesting. So I'm not sure if I'm answering Rob's question, but I've found this journey through how different kind of games do things to be very enlightening, in terms of not only like what's my preferred play experience, rather than having a contempt prior to investigation, really actually trying all these different types of games, different types of procedures, but also, is there anything I can take from that one of these games and apply to some other game that doesn't have quite so much, going on in terms of these are the protocols and the procedures, if you get what I mean. But I'm not sure at the end of the day if I have decided I don't want to play OSR games. I don't think that's the case. Although I do recognize playing right now in a couple of games that would qualify as OSR, and playing some other games which definitely do not, that they depending on the game I'm playing, it certainly suggests a certain approach to both playing and being a game master. Like they seem to inform my decisions. I'm not sure how much when I run an OSR game, how much of my decisions are being informed by how I used to do it in the past, and part of my culture of play, if you will, and how much of that is actually being suggested by the system itself, if you follow my meaning, if you've hung in this long. But my my journey is still evolving. I mean, I will agree with Robin on one thing, that a lot of those games that tend to push a certain trope or genre or whatever, the games that are very clear about how do they do what they're about, very often can kind of feel like they're pushing you into this small little area, which that's not necessarily bad, but they definitely tell you, well, this is what play is going to be about, and this is what's not going to occur in play. and so it can feel like there's barriers and you're constrained. And sometimes not only can the fiction not happen naturally, or why don't we just let these things happen? But sometimes there are parts of I hate to use the word agency, but there's things that certainly you cannot do because that's not what play is about, as opposed to something which is less prescriptive. And I'm not sure if that's a knee-jerk reaction on my part where I feel like I'm being closed in, or whether there's some validity to that. At the same time, you get to take another game and there's not a heck of a lot of guidance. I will say, and I'll probably save this for another video talking about like how I feel about the complexity of rules, because certainly right now I'm playing in some games which have a big spectrum of complexity of rules. The Lamentations of the Flame Princess or BX, not so much. This game, not very complex rules. Haven't started playing it, but they're not terribly complex. Ubiquity kind of rules medium. There's a little bit more to learn. And so far in the narrative dice system, there's more. I would say it's still probably rules medium, but there are definitely more and more things. There's more to it than Ubiquity. More things to remember. More things to consider. D100, kind of the same thing, but in a different direction. Probably more details and particulars. So I'm finding in these various games, there's points where I start to become more and more frustrated with the complexity of the game. I'm sure my friend Complex Games apologist would just roll his eyes at me, but there's a moment where I'm still figuring out like where, even though I'm pushing on the edges of my sweet spot, at what point does it start to become less comfortable? And once again, it's an evolution, it's a journey, it's something I'm still figuring out, but I'm enjoying the experience. So I hope that kind of answered Rob. I'm not sure if it really did. Maybe I'll talk more about it another time, if you can stand another long video. Have a good one, kids.